Hi everyone, hi Xers. Welcome to our Earth Day fireside chat with Edward Norton. Today's session will be moderated by our colleague Andy Karsner, and we'll have 20 minutes Q&A at the end. So please enter your questions in the dory and we'll prioritize the best questions that correlate to X projects. So without further ado, let's cue it off with a short video that Edward and Andy have collaborated on in the past.
Consider the forest. Go underground to the roots, the networks. Trees don't just share food, they share information to raise their children, protect the weak and the dying. They even support other species. What can trees teach us about community? Consider the beaver, who can build a dam without killing fish, or the mangrove, which can build a seawall without any walls. Why not learn systems from the system's master? Why not apprentice yourself to the best engineer on Earth? What if we didn't see nature as a problem to solve, but as a compass to follow? Voyagers speak of pulling an island out of the sea, which means they've guided the canoe to a place beyond the horizon. We too are voyagers. We too are seekers and doers. We each have our island to pull out of the sea. And we know there comes a time after the planning and the study, the hard work and the harder work, when there's nothing more to be done on the dock. We need to go. Our islands are out there. We need to go.
All right. Hey, Xers, happy Earth Day, 50th anniversary. It's a big look back, but even a bigger look forward. And I've got the great pleasure of talking to somebody who you all probably think you know through his art, which is magnificent. I too love Edward's acting, but the truth is that the only thing I don't like about his acting is that it takes me away from his incredible polymathic mind and the other aspects that I've known him to be an extraordinary achiever as a conservationist and an investor and a business partner, a friend, and a teacher. And so we're just going to do a little bit of what we do when I rely on his brain to sort of look out into the future and try to figure out the best moves one ought to make in terms of technology and investments and policies that shape the world we're in. So I'm just going to lay it out to Edward right where the video stops, because Edward, who you're talking to, are people who I consider some of the greatest voyagers and doers and explorers out there. A really well-meaning tribe of super intelligent, super curious, super creative technologists and activists who want to do the right thing. And we're at this crazy inflection point right now, this kind of great reset you and I have been talking about the last couple of days. So I thought I'd just start with your kind of, what do you see? What does it look like for and I don't mean the virus itself. I mean for the causes that motivate you and propel you. What is the opportunity horizon?
First off, I mean, I think everyone should know that there are many contexts in which Andy is known as the Great Carsini. I think I might have coined that appellation.
You definitely shoved the term,
because in Morocco, he was leading both deep thought and roadmap to action, as well as a lot of late night boogieing in a full Jabella and Fez. And that's when he turned into Carsini.
And don't give away all the secrets now.
I do think sometimes you've given nice context, much too nice, but I think there sometimes is some cognitive disconnect in hearing from somebody who's essentially gets paid to play dress up. And I'm lucky. I grew up in a household of serious doers. My dad is one of the great conservation litigators and strategy builders of his generation. Multiple conservation organizations he built from scratch, including the Nature Conservancy's China Country program. And my granddad, Jim Rouse, was also an incredibly pioneering thinker about how do you leverage the best of what the private sector can do with the public needs, the public social needs that aren't being addressed by the marketplace. The organization he founded, Enterprise Community Partners, is I spent a lot of my young life working there, and I worked there doing tax credit finance after college, and got a lot of the work I did in affordable housing finance cross-pollinated into the worlds of conservation and that I grew up in because of my father, and my brother's a fisheries and hydro energy expert, and my sister's in sustainable ag, and my brother-in-law is was the chief data scientist and economist for Partners in Health. And so my artistic life has tended to be sort of this moonlighting thing that I do on the side, while mostly I'm up working on this kind of stuff, and I've been lucky. I've had a lot of it around me. I think my own evolution on a lot of this thinking has been, almost from a youthful just love of being in natural places, and like a lot of us, love of animals and travel and all of it. And it's I think from, let's say in America, from the period of John Muir and Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, we have about 100 and plus odd year history of thinking about nature and natural systems from a preservationist frame of mind. We had essentially a preservationist agenda, this idea that wild places and wilderness, in almost a Byronic romantic sense, had some kind of an intrinsic spiritual value that we should make sure we preserve for future generations. And the main modality of that actually was just to draw lines around places, create inauthentic, fragmented landscapes of the places we were endeavoring to pursue our economic enterprises versus the places that we were setting aside into kind of living dioramas. And John Muir, on to David Brower, on to people like my dad, that if you look at it, despite all the best intention, all the best hard work, everything, essentially every major benchmark indicator for environmental health on the planet is not only still going in the wrong direction, it's accelerating in the wrong direction. So while not disparaging the idea of the intrinsic value of nature or the spiritual value of it, as an argument with the needs of 8 billion people, that tactic has not worked. And I think the modern era that we find ourselves in of newly emergent real consciousness of the level of crisis that we're creating, I think we're in the very beginning of the first chapter of a real tactical shift into understanding and arguing that nature has to be viewed as intrinsic, not just to our spiritual framework, but to our economic framework. And that if we continue to view the natural systems and biodiversity on the planet that we've borrowed from for basically, all of human existence as a natural capital bank, that if we deplete it, our own survival is at stake. We've barely begun the process of in a deep way understanding how do we internalize the economics of nature into our calculations of everything we do, GDP, corporate profitability, all of it, and acknowledge that we've been socializing and externalizing what are authentic costs to degrading our natural systems. And we're finally kind of, I think, waking up into the realization that this does not apply just to oil companies. It applies to literally every single enterprise on the planet is actually at risk of about 6 dimensions of destabilization and threat if we fail to incorporate respect for and sustenance of the way we integrate and with the natural systems. And I think for me, it's exciting that shift is underway, because I think it's once you take that framework, it's a really hard argument to lose. I think anybody with a brain, you have to be a willful obfuscator. You have to literally belong to the cult of I'll be gone, you'll be gone, to argue with the numbers. There is no real persuasive argument that on a 30 or even 15-year time horizon, all of our agendas toward financial maximization, which we can talk about whether that should be the agenda, are subverted by failure to deal with the planetary ecological crisis. And so I think we're at this incredibly strange, thrilling, dire, kind of liminal moment where we're both coming into a fairly sophisticated, authentic realization, acceptance, momentum toward the correct quantification and valuation of our complex natural systems. And yet we're literally on, we've got about 10 seconds left on the clock before the tipping point consequence dynamics of doubling down on the damage really do usher us into a world that is going to be a lot of rearguard survival action, because we're gonna create feedback loops that really start to make the world dangerous and dire for billions of people. And it's I think to say it's the cause of our time is hardly a stretch. I think my own view, having been involved in housing, having been involved in arts funding, having been involved in social justice issues, I have to say, like, my personal feeling at this point is that all of our geopolitical squabbles, all of our other worthy agendas are going to look like people having an argument around a dinner table while the house was burning down around them, if we don't deal with the pressing issues of ecological collapse. And I think, to me, it's if our grandparents' call to action was to rise up against the threat of global fascism because it was a true global existential threat, this is certainly ours. I think, and my engagement with it has intellectual roots, it has spiritual roots, but really I kind of feel more and more that this is, if we want any claim to some of the achievements of what we call the greatest generation, our generation is really going to have to seriously put aside the convenience of what our other aspirations were, and at every dimension, whether you're an actor, a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, a programmer, like, everybody is going to have to get engaged with this on some level, because I think by the time we all have grandkids, and probably some of us already do, it's going to become our Grandpa, what did you do in the war question. How we dealt with this is going to be our ethical legacy on a lot of levels. And I think that anytime there's a disruption like the virus, I think there's opportunity within it. I think if we squander the opportunity to really structurally rethink a lot of what opens the door and exacerbates a moment like this, it'll be to our shame, and unfortunately, I think as everybody knows, it'll just mean that we revisit these suppressed circumstances even more quickly. So I think even as we kind of sink into a meditative place by being forced to be at home or whatever, what I've been trying to almost think about is how do we actually not be less active but more active from within isolation and quarantine, because I think the moment is here and we've got to deal with it. And I think that it's going to take the what you guys are represents what we need to do. We need the cross-pollination, interdisciplinary, moonshot ideas being pursued in earnest because we need them really fast.
Edward, let's take some of your specific experience. I mean, that's such a great framing umbrella. I mean, of all the things that you and I have either collaborated on or argued about, we've always been completely aligned on how do you deal with time-based urgency for a time-based problem set, right? And so what we're trying to find out, what we're trying to examine right now in all of our different silos is how do we adjust our order of operations and our thinking and our prioritization in order to incorporate the reset and deal with the urgency, right? But you've got very specific, I mean, you are invested in a co-founder in a data science company, albeit for, with Nadler and some of the best thinkers out there. You're advising Vista on where to go with, hundreds of millions of dollars, in this environment. How do we apply thinking that shifts or let me say this: how do we apply thinking towards applications that shift the use of our technologies and the direction of our money to the greatest effect with the greatest priority?
Well, I mean, there's different dimensions of that. I think that lots of people I think there's emergent parallel articulations of an ethos that I think to me is very persuasive. You see Mark Benioff talking about that corporations need to address stakeholder values as opposed to shareholder values, and I think accurately saying employee welfare, family, community, environmental health. These need to be assessed on par with shareholder value, right? That idea of stakeholder value versus shareholder value. A friend of mine, Yancey Strickler, who many of you probably know, was a co-founder of Kickstarter and CEO. Yancey's put this book out that I can't recommend highly enough in the context of this conversation. It's called "This Could Be Our Future." I've been going back to it because I think he does such a terrific job of dissecting the embedded canards and hypocrisies and full-on illusions and damages wrought by the cult of financial maximization, which has not always actually been even our economic ethos as a country. It really can be traced to Milton Friedman and the post-war kind of obsession with shareholder value as the single metric for what corporate ideology was framed around. And I think Yancey does an incredibly great job in his book dissecting how did we become a culture of financial maximization, and what are the fallacies within that, what are the detriments to all of us from it, and what are the alternatives, what are the options that are available to us. His articulation of what Mark calls shareholder values, he calls kind of humorously bentoism, meaning in reference to the Japanese lunchbox with 4 quadrants and how you need to allocate equally into the quadrants. And I think that I agree with all of that. I do think it's, when you talk about it's very hard to talk about applied technology, applied financial models, applied educational models. It's very hard to talk about revolutionizing those things if under each and every one of them remains a death cult of financial maximization, right? If that's all anybody is talking about, and if that is the driving root, none of those applied vectors can produce anything other than a degraded future. And that is just a stone cold fact. And I think that you can't even look at application unless you look at the collective cultural ethos that's under it. And I think that it's very, very worth contemplating in a very bracing way what it is that the cult of financial maximization has done to everything, because really at the end of the day, we're applying our skills and talents, whether we know it or not, usually into a matrix of financial maximization as opposed to human interest and human well-being. So I would say that in this time of contemplation, I think Yancey's book, among a couple of others, is a really good confrontation with that very idea. But I think that there's no question, I think, too, that we, when people talk about rethinking capitalism, part of it is that I think we have to look at the ways. There are definitely ways to re-engineer virtually everything we're doing in a market sense, in ways where more of that equity. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the social safety net and how, in a moment like this, what we're seeing is, I don't want to be too R-rated in this, but Andy and I were talking the other night about how what's going on is kind of like a black light shined on a hotel room sheet. It's showing us a lot of what we have not wanted to see about how truly vulnerable we've made our society, how few people are actually included in the social safety net. And I think that that's true in an environmental sense too. But we because underneath a lot of this virus stuff, of course, as people in this group know especially, there's a lot about the way we interact with biodiversity that is really directly at the root of these wet markets and the way we look at wildlife. The permissiveness we have around wildlife trade and stuff like that is specifically embedded within the percolation and spread of these pandemics. But I think that I think we need really, it's like an all hands on deck thing. My education in sort of the ways that you could lever traditional market-based dynamics really came more in my work in housing through my grandfather. My grandfather was he was a commercial real estate developer, very progressive in his thinking, but not until really he retired and started looking at the dynamics of affordable housing and why the market, capital markets weren't moving money into affordable housing. Did he start to think, well, how do we address that if government, funding and the markets are leaving this gap? And basically in the mid 80s, they came up with something called the low-income housing tax credit. My grandfather was one of the intellectual forefathers of the low-income housing tax credit, which passed in the 86 Tax Act. And, literally hundreds of billions of market capital has moved into investment in affordable housing because of the clever insight of leveraging modest incentives into investment that in affordable housing through for-profit equity funds, combined with investment in community-based capacity building and looking at affordable housing through the lens of the nonprofit matrix. This twisting of the Rubik's Cube created a mechanism that is far and away, it's when people talk in America about impact investment models, I would argue the low-income housing tax credit is, in our time, one of the most effective instruments ever built for levering market capital into a social impact modality and giving people good returns at the same time. And I think that the two things I learned in the experience of working at enterprise community partners over the years were that these kinds of clever, sophisticated partnerships between market capital and mission-driven work could, if you weren't looking at financial maximization, you could still get positive, finance outcomes and do highly levered positive social impact outcomes that were a true win-win-win-win-win. They were like 4-quadrant wins. But the other thing that I really learned in that I think is germane is that no matter where you come down on the political spectrum, one of the things that's just true is that top-down funding matrix never really works for problem solving. You need community-based capacity, and enterprise has brought, I think, 17 or 18 billion of market capital into the nonprofit of affordable housing development movement. But none of that would have been applicable or effectively applied without this network of 7,000 US-based, community-based nonprofit groups that are now social service providers and housing developers. The same is true in conservation. I think Andy and I met on the board of Conservation International, and I think something you could say about CI, which has probably levered more philanthropic and multinational capital toward enterprise-based conservation than any org in the world, is that the success and failure of the download of that macro capital is completely contingent on whether there's strong community-based implementing partners. Without strong community-based, without the local, the macro just doesn't work. And I think this is a truism that's very applicable to many of the things you guys are working on in there. I think that you at the same time that we devote the R&D and the macro capital capacity, we have to invest in the local. We have to invest in the community-based component of the network effect, because a lot of times it's the communities on the front lines of these issues, often communities of poverty, that have to be a part of any kind of effective deployment of the kinds of things you guys are working on in there. It's all great to be inside the labs and coming up with the ideas, but it disappears into the sand really fast without real community-based capacity. And I think that that's actually affected a lot of where I invest my own time and effort, in terms of I think, like, I love being part of CI, but I always felt that in a lot of ways, my efforts were best applied toward projects to build community-based capacity and critical ecosystems, and then work to connect that with what I knew CI was capable of.
A lot of your commentary and good wisdom, guides us to things that we haven't overly invested on, at the Moonshot factory, but we're running up against the guardrails of, in terms of, how quickly we can get to market on stuff. And that is, what does good policy look like? So I'm just going to read you a couple of the questions that deal with policy and markets. I've got some of the world's best technologists and engineers of every kind, mechanical, electrical, chemical, software. But where we run into trouble is not sufficiently understanding this community nexus, this policy framework, and how to even, you get in a cul-de-sac sometimes where you go, well, if I just had the carbon tax, or if we just had the Paris Agreement, if we just had the big macro, without kind of the bottom-up strategy that is what led to the housing credit, which, as you say, it has been a lightning rod for capital in ways that we have not achieved for nature or for climate change or anything else. So a lot of the questions, I'm going to read just two or three of them, because you can kind of meld them together to make an answer. What are your feelings on the importance of social collaboration and the methods to harness collective lift towards making a difference for any large-scale platform? Here's another one. To move from shareholder to stakeholder value, we need to move from only being driven by GDP productivity, away from being driven exclusively by GDP productivity. How do we move on that collectively as a society? And then the chronic one that you get is, we are failing, the technical, the educated, on something that is objective to communicate and reach greater people for movement. How do we improve, our means of outreach, communication, advocacy, education? And then here's one: reflecting on your family's experiences, what sort of environment conservation action tends to proliferate most widely and rapidly beyond the initial project itself? So I got a ton more, but I don't know if you want to grab a few of them.
Well, it's interesting. I think when you talk about policy, it's really hard, obviously, to set good policy if you don't have good data and good, if you don't have honest economics, for instance. And I think you and I are both fans of the work of Pavan Sukhdev, our friend, among others in his field. For those of you who haven't dug into Pavan's work for the UN, Pavan was he ran commodities trading for Deutsche Bank in Asia for many years, and was a commodities specialist. And he essentially told me he found himself. His daughter asked him, why don't we put a price on things like water and air? And he said, well, because those are free. And he stayed up all night realizing that was a lie, and he knew it. And from that grew this incredible work that he did called the Teeb Report, which has many dimensions now. And I really encourage you to check out. It stands for the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. If we don't do next generation accounting around the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, for instance, we're going to measure GDP just as inauthentically as we've measured it for our first 200 years of our industrial history, in which we've externalized the negative costs of extractive degradation economies. And until we actually internalize that, we don't have authentic measurements of GDP. Pavan has a great line that nature is the GDP of the poor, and he's done some incredible work around things like looking with Bangladesh at their clearing of mangrove swamps for shrimp farms, and shown that the clearing of mangrove farms for forests for shrimp farms creates negative GDP in less than 10 years because of its impact on fisheries, its deleterious effect on storm surge protection, on and on. And I think the better we get at modeling what's the authentic economic contribution of biodiversity and ecosystems, the harder it gets the easier it gets to shine a light on the fact that where we have been reporting positive GDP, we've been actually creating impoverishment at a massive scale. And that's a function of data. It's a function of more and more nuanced understanding of the direct cause effect of negative environmental occurrences and what the mitigating effects of healthy systems were on those versus if they're gone. Obviously, into that process, mapping, more and more sophisticated planetary mapping, like you guys are doing, more and more sophisticated understanding, dissection of the actual direct economic cause and effect of complex systems, their radiating effects into human health and those costs. The better we get at modeling at a granular level, the economic interconnectivity of natural systems and biodiversity with every aspect of our lives, the harder and harder it is to argue for this kind of status quo economic policy, right? It's very, very hard to sit with developing world countries and argue that they shouldn't do the same thing we did unless you can actually sit and show them that they are not, in fact, going to get the growth that they think they're going to get. And same for the U.S. and China too, by the way. But I think the funny thing is, like, deep science, deep AI, mapping, all of it. These are critical tools. They're part of the feedstock of what allows us to make the economic case, and that's, I think, contingent. It's a contingent piece of policy shift, right? Because it's very hard to get policy shift without being able to make the case for preferential economics, and that's just the reality. Some people don't want to hear that. They don't want the defense of nature to be rooted in an economic argument. I tend to disagree. I think it has to be now, because I think it's the only way you and by the way, if you don't have large institutional investors like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or CalPERS realizing that if they're invested in portfolio assets that don't sustain, on a 30-year horizon create instability, and making choices about, how they deploy their capital and what kind of constraints they put on their capital managers, we won't get that kind of leverage. So it all stovepipes upward. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a big, and there are people who we love who are on the opposite side of that discussion. That's a big, there's a big metaphysical question of, well, nature is priceless and it has this spiritual dimension, which of course we appreciate. But, I think you and I and Pavan and Rockstrom and a lot of people would respond, there is a price on it. The price that the market is assigning is zero, because we are not allowing the value of nature's beneficence to compete with the value of exploiting and extracting of it. And it's very similar inside the
beyond that, we're socializing those costs. Those costs do not exist. We're socializing them to everyone else.
Yeah, we're privatizing the gain and socializing the risk, and it's a deleterious, empirically deleterious risk. But I have the same conundrum inside the Moonshot Factory. So much of what we do is based on tool creation to have a mission, impact, purpose, a moonshot. And whether that's aquaculture, agriculture, forestry, insurance, finance, investments, the grid, it all comes off of this base of what do we do with the tool. And I think if I'm parsing what you're saying, and really trying to translate it for our folks is be fearless in seeking to assign the value of exposing that data, that quantification of things that aren't currently on the balance sheet of market economies, because otherwise it's an asymmetrical discussion, right? It'll always, I tell our folks that what we do goes on already. Measuring nature for exploitation and extraction is an unbelievably polished art by the world's best engineers. And so we've got to be better about measuring it for conservation and for longevity of our species in the tools that we're creating. Now that we're the ones with the capital, now that this has shifted away from Washington and Houston and into centers of creativity and innovation. But I think it's really validating to hear from you.
I would say, I've in our work in Kenya with a great community-based org we've built over the last 20 years called the Maasai Wilderness Conservation Trust. We had some interactions with the early iterations of Google Earth. That tool, was helpful to a degree. But I bring that up only to say that, like,
can't wait to get to our factory, man. That's primitive now.
Yeah, if I was sitting with what you guys do, of course, needs to be paired with, let's call it the philanthropic capacity of the whole org too, Google and Alphabet, et cetera. And I would say, this is just my opinion, but to me, the efficacy of deployment of everything you guys are building will be in direct relationship to how much is invested in community-based capacity building. Because if you don't have community-based capacity to deploy those tools, they will not inflect what they're intended to inflect. And I think that, to me, the Moonshot tools, like if we haven't laid the ground, if we haven't prepared the ground, arguably through philanthropic capital, but also hopefully through innovative market-based ways of underwriting community-based, mission-driven work, it'll all be this lovely discussion that we're having, but we won't really see these things deployed. And I think that, one of the things Enterprise did exceedingly well, even as it built, the finance products to lever 17 billion of market capital from banks who needed a place to put their CRA money and all that kind of stuff. Enterprise was raising and investing hundreds of millions of dollars in transforming little community-based advocacy groups like the Community League of Washington Heights and turning them into housing developers, and that was straight up philanthropic capital. That was philanthropic capital making a venture investment in community capacity building so that the sophisticated Moonshot tool they created, which was the low-income housing tax credit and the partnerships with the banks to give them levered returns through the tax credit on investment in affordable housing, had a place to go. You literally wouldn't have, an organization. I think the estimate the Ford Foundation ran recently was that 1 in every 110 families in America has lived in a unit of housing developed by enterprise community partners at this point. Millions of units of housing, largest developer of affordable housing in the country, and nonprofit other than government, and the Moonshot in that sector that they developed of this brilliant financial impact investment tool literally succeeded only because of a massive investment in community capacity building. Now I think the network is 10,000 US community-based groups turned into nonprofit housing developers and social service providers by that partnership. And I do think it's like one of these crossover questions. It's like you guys have to be talking to the philanthropic capacity component of your org needs to work hand in glove to literally build the partners who are going to deploy specifically the tools you're building. And I think that's to me as a tactical thing. We've seen that in conservation, we've seen it in housing, that innovation and macro capacity go nowhere without the community-based partners to implement it, and that means making sure that there are lots of, as esoteric as it sounds, Maasai Wilderness Conservation Trust. Well, that sounds esoteric, but in fact what that is a regional organization that is essentially playing the role of advocate for the Amboseli-Tsavo ecosystem, the second largest East African grasslands migratory system next to the Serengeti, and it is a place. It's an ecosystem that's in CI and a bunch of other orgs, critical ecosystem portfolio, because its watershed delivers the water to about a quarter of Kenya's population, and so it needs a home-baked, home-built, sustainably operated advocate for the dynamics of its communities and its regional nuances. But and that has been, and when you look at the relationship between, say, that org and Conservation International's incredible capacity at developing, carbon, VCS registered carbon projects, the legal frameworks necessary for those kind of complex things. The things we've done as a small regional org, we could have never done without the macro capacity and the technical capacity and the innovation that CI brought. But you need both hands. You need both sides of that equation. And I think, to me, I have no idea. I'm not presuming to say it's not happening. But I guess if I was looking at it from the outside, something like what you guys are doing, I would say it'd be an interesting question to ask, which is, does every single thing we're doing have a dozen pre-identified? Is there a dev process in parallel that is setting up a dozen community-based partners who will be shovel ready to implement whatever we build? And if not, what are we doing to do that?
Yeah. And I think it's obvious to anybody who's listening, you know what you're talking about. But just to footnote it in case it's not in Edward's bio, he founded a platform called CrowdRise, which has evolved into GoFundMe, which is one of the larger platforms that's aggregating philanthropic capital, even sort of from the bottom up. And he was a teacher to me when I was managing large portions of philanthropy at the Emerson Collective and using these platforms to maximize and optimize inputs from the bottom up, was sort of out having to wait every time for the one-off grant from somebody. I think of it as capital agnosticism, that we've got to think whether it's for-profit capital, nonprofit capital, university programmatic capital, whether it's patient capital, like we have a little bit of a license for. How do you make all of these things more effective than the sum of their parts? And you've kind of mastered that in your portfolio. The questions I'm getting, Edward, which you may or may not want to engage because, but inevitably you're going to get them. A couple of them are about Hollywood, and they're good. You've been a writer, producer, director, funder, in addition to being, an award-winning actor. And so kind of in you know the scene out there. There's a lot of people talking, but not as many with your kind of credibility on content or experience. But so the core question is, well, truly, what could Hollywood do that moves the needle, changes humanity, and could make people care more? And it's similar to that, you know, somebody, when you were talking about the death cult of financial maximization, Brian wrote, speaking of death cults, the news is making it kind of hard to keep our faith in humanity up right now. As someone who has a foot in both arts and ecological issues, what do you personally focus on to stay hopeful? It's a good way to close.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, narrative is important. Narrative, I'm in that part of my life, I'm in the business of narrative and storytelling, and sometimes I feel cynical or a little bit deflated about whether, you know, popular entertainment, forget whether it should, can it really do anything other than act as a palliative? You know, is our movies anything other than hospice care while we're dying? I don't know. Sometimes I get very worried about that. But I will say that, let's take, for instance, Jim Cameron and Avatar, right? I mention it not just because I happen to love the ecological the mythological narrative of that creates a heroism out of integration with ecology and a villainy out of cutting down trees, right? If you think about that film, the central emotional event of that first film was that a tree fell, which is pretty fantastic. And to me, when something like that transcends to where it is still to this day the most popular, the most widely viewed piece of filmed entertainment ever made on a global basis, it has as its central narrative a mythology that celebrates integration with nature. And I don't think that's nothing. I think that is something. I think young people, when you look at the Greta Thunberg generation, it would be hard to discount that which enters into the psychology of young people and frames for them a sense of what does heroism constitute and what does villainy constitute. Those things can matter, and I think it matters. I think it matters when, if you see documentaries like you know, Inconvenient Truth, or even more recently that terrific one on plant-based eating called The Game Changers. You know, narrative matters. Narrative helps people reframe their priorities. It helps set their sense of who they want to be aspirationally, and maybe it can be contributive in some ways. I think that
and what makes
yeah, go ahead.
And what makes you hopeful right now? What do you focus on to keep the flame lit in your own hope?
I think that on any historical sense, if you sort of erased what you know about what ultimately transpired and placed yourself into the context of many moments in human history that seemed very dark, I think that what ended up becoming the levers of extraction from a dire moment for people were not ones that people would have predicted even 5 years, let alone 10 years before they emerged. I think one of the things I always liked about Kevin Kelly's books, Out of Control and What Technology Wants, his kind of meditations on emergence theory and on the idea that a lot can be happening in a system that we really don't see the evidence of an emergent phenomenon until literally the moment that it happens. The idea that the molecules of water in the toilet do not indicate a whirlpool until you pull that lever. And we don't know what the levers will be. It is, in fact, hubris and presumptive to think that we can actually see what the speed of cause and effect will be with the actions that we take. And we have solved some very complex shit in our history, and we have solved it very fast. I actually took my son to the Air and Space Museum not that long ago, and I found myself, I'm a pilot, and I found myself actually pretty entranced by this one room at the Air and Space Museum. It's a U-shaped room, and on the far left they have Lindbergh's. They have not Lindbergh. They have the engine of the Wright brothers' first flyer, and as you move along, it's just engines. And on the far right is the engine of Chuck Yeager's X-1 rocket plane that broke the sound barrier. Now that first engine is in 1903, and Chuck Yeager's is in 1963. So that's 60 years of very high speed innovation. Why? Because the motivation was high. Flight was a big deal to the human psychology, a big deal to everything. And we were motivated. People were motivated to layer innovation on top of innovation very fast. You know, Wright brothers flyer to the X-1 plane in 60 years is pretty goddamn impressive. And if we're capable of that, I think it's presumptive to say that we know what we might pull off in the next, 25 years, let alone 50. And I think as much as it feels like, God, how do we reverse this? I do have this kind of like tickle of anticipation that things are going to emerge, and that we just have to keep pressing on it.
Right. It's a good place for us to close out. I can't thank you enough for your time, Edward. You're already in the doer tribe. Obviously, you're one of the greatest warriors for humanity and nature I've ever met. And so we want to baptize you into the X tribe when all this flu abates, and actually have you come and get to know, our Moonshot factory, our toy factory, depending on how you look at it. But your thinking can be really vital in helping us shape the direction and the velocity at which these tools make impact, because you're out there in the community, feet in the mud, head in the sky, really changing things on the ground. I
appreciate it. I mean, I will say, like when I went to college, I went to Yale, and I thought I had notions of being an astronomer or a physicist, and it took me about one semester to realize that I did not have the math. Just period, full stop. And I became a humanities major and environmental studies, and found my way in that direction. And like I said, I mean, I think I appreciate all you're saying. In some ways, I've drafted off the knowledge of a lot of other people that I've been privileged to get to meet and work with, and maybe what I've leveraged is, like I said, the narrative, the ability to synthesize a lot of what we're all working on into narrative is important. But my level of admiration for what you guys are actually doing, for the deep technical, innovative work is, I'm jealous. I wish I did that work. I really do. And I think that it is the most important work in the world right now. I mean, we have got to crack the code on our intractable problems, and I think that it's, to me, to the degree that I even know through Andy and others that I know, Sundar, about what you guys are working on, it's I mean, I can't say enough how deeply important and admirable I think it is. I think it's our fate is hanging on people making some moonshot breakthroughs with ideas that the general public doesn't even know are coming. We're gonna have to hack our way out of this, and I think because all the best intentioned efforts in the modalities that we've been in haven't done the job. So we have to change them up, and in some cases it's structural. In some cases, I do think it's ethical, like we were talking about financial maximization. Andy and I have been working on an idea called conservation equity with some others, where we realized, like, hey, look, if you look at global tourism and you just take the profit incentive out of it, you realize, hey, the equity returns on high grade tourism are actually quite compelling. But what if we, instead of relying on, what if we just financed that? Instead of donating ad infinitum to conservation, what if we built finance facilities to just, at low cost finance, leave conservation implementation orgs holding the equity value of the most famous tourism brands in the world, like Amman and Six Senses and Four Seasons, etc. And lo and behold, that's just a couple of twists of the Rubik's Cube to say, hey, wait a minute, there's an easy way. Instead of building gargantuan outsized endowment funds, having to raise ad infinitum philanthropic capital, we can actually recycle capital and leave equity returns going to conservation instead of breadcrumbs off the edge of it. That's finance. That's a not even super complex innovation in a finance model that could be quite transformative for conservation underwriting. But we need equivalent technical. We need breakthroughs on technical levels as well. We need more powerful ways, for instance, of assessing additionality in carbon forest degradation efforts. We need to be able to prove that the things we're actually doing are having impact with complicated scientific and monitoring and all that kind of stuff. And so it all goes hand in glove, but we sure do need some real breakthroughs in terms of moving beyond the modalities that we've been in.
Yeah, Edward, if people who know you and I know we could go on for hours. In fact, we usually do, and probably will even later today. But I hope to get these people have got to jump off, and I hope to get them around campfires with us and get you to together with them. You've had this unbelievably great year before all of this happened with Motherless Brooklyn, and if people haven't seen it, what Ken Burns said about it is right, that it's one of the greatest pieces of American cinematography and storytelling that has ever been out there, and is forever going to live next to Chinatown and some of the greatest of the genre. But you have so much left in you artistically and in commerce and in policy and in so many ways to contribute. And we hope we can help populate your thinking and iterate with you in the weeks and months ahead, because we're not going back to March 1st, and the future's got to be invented. And you've left us with a ton of fodder of thinking about our role in it. And so I'm just so very grateful for you sharing your character. Well,
it's probably not the most, we're not having the Earth Day that's about
big rally,
hugging trees and running around maypoles, or even getting together for a big concert or something like that. But in some ways, maybe that's good. I think we're having a bracing confrontation with what happens when we let some of the demons out of the box, and I think if it's forcing a reflectivity and renewed sense of purpose, then maybe we'll look back on it as not only catastrophic.
It'll be interesting to on the 51st one to look back and say, wow, that was the least emission intensive Earth Day in 50 years. And the skies were bluer than ever, and the waters were cleaner. And, now that we have a baseline of what man-made impact actually looks like, how do we engineer ourselves to be more symbiotic? Thanks, brother. It's been fantastic. And
thanks. Well, I look forward to coming up and seeing what you guys are doing firsthand. That'd be amazing.
Most welcome. Doer and Xer. Ed Norton, if there were a virtual clap, this would be the time that the applause would be roaring. All right. See you soon, man.
Thanks.